Welcome back to another deep dive. I am incredibly glad you decided to spend some time with us today. Whether you're a brand new listener joining us for the first time, or you are the learner who's been with us through dozens of these explorations, do us a quick favor right out of the gate.
Yeah, take just a second to like and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you're using.
Exactly. It's the absolute best way to support what we do, and it ensures we can keep bringing you these incredibly detailed breakdowns of the texts that are actively shaping the modern world.
And the text we have laid out on the table today is to call it dense would be a massive understatement.
Oh, yeah.
It's a highly controversial, overwhelmingly data-heavy piece of work that's been making some serious waves in the cultural discourse lately.
That is putting it mildly. Today's deep dive is an extensive review of a brand new ebook titled Beyond Infinite Anaximander's Boundless Universe by Conrad Riker. And I want to set the stage right up front. If you find yourself hooked by the concepts we're unpacking today, if you want to see the original footnotes and the raw data for yourself, you should immediately check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
It's available there right now.
Right. And you can also follow the author and read his continued real-time thoughts on his Substack at Conrad Riker.
It really is the kind of text that demands absolute attention because it's attempting to completely reframe how we view the structural foundations of society.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive, and specifically who this book was written to reach. We always make it a point to understand the intended audience of our source material, and Riker's book it's unapologetically custom-tailored for a men's rights activist, or MRA, audience, as well as red-pilled manosphere men.
The core premise of this massive volume is a rigorous historical and biological defense of traditional masculinity.
Yeah, he's aiming to unpack the history of Western institutions before, as he forcefully argues they were captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
But before we delve into the actual arguments, we need to establish the ground rules for our discussion today. This is critical when dealing with material this polarizing.
Yes, this is an absolutely crucial step. We are taking a completely neutral analytical lens today. We are not taking sides.
Right.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the data interpretations, or the political ideologies presented in this book. Our mission here is strictly to impartially report on the content provided.
We are here to decode Riker's arguments, lay them out clearly, and convey the sheer depth of the ideas contained in the original source material.
Exactly. The goal is for you, the listener, to understand exactly what is driving this massive cultural conversation, regardless of where your own personal politics land.
We're acting as translators for a very specific worldview. And just to give you a high-level overview of where we're heading today, we're going to trace Riker's arguments from their philosophical roots all the way to his proposed modern solutions.
So we're starting with the ancients.
Right. We'll look at how he uses ancient philosophy, specifically the pre-Socratic thinker Anaximander, to frame what he calls the competence backlash. Then we'll examine his deconstruction of historical matriarchies, dive into the escapism epidemic currently affecting modern men, and finally, look at what he terms the red pill awakening.
All right, let's start right at the foundation, section 1. The opening thesis of the book makes a really bold claim. He says that the foundational traits of masculinity, things like cold logic, pure ambition, and a drive for competence, are actively being pathologized in modern institutions.
And he doesn't start with abstract theory either. He starts with a very specific modern corporate anecdote that really sets the stage.
Yeah, the Google story.
Right. The book opens with a story about a senior software engineer at Google. This engineer was having a formal conversation with an HR representative regarding a dispute over team communication styles. According to Riker's account, the HR rep looked at this highly skilled engineer and explicitly told him that logic is toxic.
Wait, logic is toxic. That exact phrase is being used inside one of the most powerful technology and engineering companies on Earth.
That's the exact irony Riker is highlighting. The context here is that the engineer was defending his position using a very strict logical structure known as the iron syllogism, specifically modus tollens.
Okay, let's pause there and break that down for a second. Explain modus tollens to me like I skipped Logic 101. What exactly was the engineer doing?
Well, it's a fundamental rule of logical inference. It basically states if P is true, then Q is true. Q is false, therefore P is false.
So it's mathematical.
Exactly. For example, if it's raining, the street is wet. The street is not wet, therefore it is not raining. It leaves absolutely no room for feelings or subjective interpretation. It's pure, cold reasoning.
And he used this in a meeting.
Riker points out that the engineer was using this exact structure to prove that a certain project management decision was objectively failing. But the corporate system, represented by HR, prioritized the emotional testimony of the team over the iron syllogism.
So the engineer won the debate on purely logical grounds, but the system still favored the emotional narrative of how his logic made the team feel.
Precisely. And Riker argues that when logic itself is exiled from the boardroom, we aren't just getting slightly less efficient code. He claims we're losing the very spine of civilization.
And he backs this up with some pretty heavy data on what he calls the competence backlash effect.
He brings in a massive 2022 meta-analysis published in the journal Nature Human Behavior. This wasn't some fringe study. This was a major look at how confidence and competence are perceived in the modern workplace.
What did the data actually show? Is it just a feeling of being persecuted? Or is there a measurable backlash against men?
According to the findings Riker highlights, there's a very measurable systemic double standard. The meta-analysis showed that men who express high confidence and demonstrate overt high ability are actively penalized in progressive corporate institutions.
Penalized how?
In their 360-degree workplace evaluations, these confident men are consistently rated as less likable and difficult to work with. However, the study found that women who exhibit the exact same confident, highly competent traits are routinely praised as inspiring or trailblazing.
That is fascinating. So the exact same behavioral input yields two completely different institutional outputs based entirely on gender.
Yeah, and Riker piles on the data here. He points to a 2020 analysis out of the London School of Economics. They looked at the BBC television show Dragon's Den, which is the British equivalent of Shark Tank. The LSE researchers analyzed the transcripts of the pitches and the interactions between the entrepreneurs and the wealthy investors.
What did they find when they looked at the language?
They found that male entrepreneurs who pitched identical ideas, using the identical financial metrics and identical levels of confidence as female entrepreneurs, received 3 times more criticism for their assertiveness.
3 times more.
Right. When a man stood his ground on evaluation, it was coded by the investors and the editing of the show as aggressive or stubborn. When a woman exhibited the exact same behavior, it was coded as passionate and fierce.
That's a massive statistical variance. And Riker ties this directly into modern diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI training programs, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that modern DEI modules are explicitly training middle managers to monitor what the corporate literature calls dominance cues in male employees. We're talking about basic, historically standard professional behaviors, making direct and sustained eye contact, having a firm handshake, projecting your voice in a meeting, or even taking the head seat at a conference table.
So behaviors that were literally taught in business schools for the last century as the hallmarks of effective leadership are now being reframed as what? Microaggressions.
According to Riker, yes. He argues that under the new corporate religion, these aren't viewed as signs of leadership. They're viewed as precursors to abuse. Male presence is essentially treated with suspicion by default. Ambition in men is no longer something to be nurtured by a mentor. It's something to be surveilled by a compliance officer.
Which brings us to an anecdote in the book that honestly sounds like satire, but it's apparently completely real. It takes place in a Toronto elementary school in 2023. A male teacher was suspended from his job, not for misconduct, not for a curriculum violation, but for starting a chess club.
A chess club, a game of pure strategy that's been played since the 6th century in India, refined in Persia, and used to teach spatial reasoning for over a millennium.
But the administration suspended him because they claimed that starting a chess club was actively promoting toxic masculinity.
Let's look at the mechanics of why they would make that claim, according to Riker's analysis. Chess reward strategy, immense patience, and ultimate zero-sum competition. There is a winner and a loser.
No participation trophies in chess.
Exactly. Riker's takeaway is that ideological administrators target things like chess precisely because it rewards winning. And winning relies on a hierarchical mindset that boys are biologically wired to value and pursue.
So if we pull back from the specific examples of the Google engineer and the chess teacher, what is the larger speculation here? If a society fundamentally medicalizes mastery, if it looks at the drive to win, the drive to build, and calls it toxic, so that it can literally medicate or socially engineer it out of existence, what happens to the structural integrity of that society?
That is the core existential question of the book's first section. Riker is painting a picture of a culture that is actively taking a sledgehammer to the psychological infrastructure that built it. He writes, "We pathologize victory."
Right.
If you teach an entire generation of young boys that wanting to win, wanting to strategize, and wanting to lead is somehow a poison in their blood, you do not magically get a gentler, more utopian society.
You get it collapsing.
According to Riker, yes. You get an empire that isn't conquered by an outside army, but is simply abandoned from within by a class of builders who decided that competence wasn't worth the punishment anymore.
Which is a perfect transition to section 2. If modern corporate culture is actively filtering out these historically male traits of assertiveness, it begs a massive logistical question. Who is actually physically building the world? The emails can be polite, but someone still has to dig the tunnels.
And that's where the book pivots to this brutal concept of the silent provider and the pyramid principle.
The pyramid principle, how does Riker define that?
He asserts that human civilization does not operate on consensus, empathy, or sensitivity training. It operates on a massive pyramid built entirely by male sacrifice, extreme risk-taking, and raw physical endurance.
And he brings in some incredibly sobering data from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, from the year 2023. We are talking about workplace fatalities. The numbers show that men make up 93% of overall workplace fatalities. And in the construction industry specifically, they make up 93% of the fatalities.
Let that number sink in for a moment. 93%. That is not a slight statistical majority. That is almost the absolute entirety of workplace deaths. That is the literal cost of keeping the lights on.
It really reframes the way you look at a skyline or a highway system. How does Riker interpret this data culturally? Because you certainly don't see massive cultural movements trying to equalize the gender disparity in deep-sea welding or high-voltage line repair.
Right. He argues that in modern feminist discourse, these massive fatality numbers are treated in one of two ways. They are either completely ignored because they are inconvenient to the narrative of male privilege, or they are cynically reframed as proof of male oppression under capitalism.
Meaning, the argument becomes, look how terrible capitalism is. It forces these poor men to work dangerous jobs.
Exactly, but Riker vehemently rejects that framing. He argues that this isn't about capitalist oppression, it's about intrinsic male heroism. These men didn't die so a middle manager in HR could get a promotion. They died so cargo ships could pass through freezing waters, so trade could flow across continents, and so the power grid would stay on during a blizzard.
He has a quote in the book that really stuck with me. He says, "Their names aren't on the building, but the world runs on their bones."
It's a very visceral, almost ancient way to describe modern infrastructure.
And this leads into a massive point of contention in modern education policy, the STEM paradox. We're all aware of the massive global push to get more women into science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Riker cites the financial reality of this push. Over $4 billion has been poured into Title IX STEM initiatives in recent years.
Billions of dollars. Decades of diversity mandates, special scholarships, dedicated camps. But despite all of that social engineering, the percentage of actual engineering degrees going to women is sitting at just 14%. And the most damning part of Riker's data is that this 14% number has been essentially stagnant for a decade. It's not moving.
Which forces a very uncomfortable question. Why? Riker uses this stagnation to argue that the disparity is not born of systemic oppression, a lack of access, or exclusion. It is born of fundamental biology and differing biological risk tolerances.
And he looks at the historical context too, right?
He does. He notes that between the years 1800 and 1950, 98.7% of all engineering degrees in the United States went to men.
That spans the entirety of the Industrial Revolution.
Right. His argument is that most women, when given absolute freedom of choice in a wealthy society, simply do not want to spend their 20s sleeping in mud camps, welding freezing pipelines in the Alaskan tundra, or repairing high-voltage transformers in the middle of a thunderstorm. Nature, he says, does not care about your preferred pronouns or your equity goals. Nature cares about survival. And survival in harsh environments rewards aggressive risk-taking, a trait that is overwhelmingly coded male.
He uses an analogy from ancient Rome that I found really compelling. He contrasts the Fabri with the Vestal Virgins.
The Fabri were the male skilled workers, the engineers, the stonemasons, the blacksmiths. They were the ones who actually plotted the gradients for the aqueducts, poured the Roman concrete, and laid the roads that connected the empire.
And on the other side of the cultural spectrum, you had the Vestal Virgins.
Yes. The Vestal Virgins were highly respected priestesses. They held immense cultural, religious, and even political power. They were untouchable. But, as Riker points out, they didn't work on gradients. They didn't calculate the load-bearing weight of a bridge. Their primary role was to keep a sacred, symbolic fire burning in the temple.
Riker's point being that while the role of the Vestal Virgin may have been deeply honorable and socially celebrated, it did absolutely nothing to expand or maintain the physical infrastructure of the empire. Rome operated, expanded, and survived entirely on the backs of its male planners, soldiers, and engineers.
And he theorizes that when the Roman Empire finally collapsed, it wasn't because men held too much toxic power. It was because the society stopped valuing duty and allowed a bloated administrative state to erode actual, tangible competence.
So how does this historical wiring manifest today? Riker brings in a 2021 Gallup poll to illustrate the psychological chasm that still exists. The poll asked men and women where they derive their sense of life purpose.
70% of men stated that they find their ultimate life's purpose in providing for their family. By contrast, only 38% of women answered the same way.
That is a massive gap, almost double.
Riker calls this a chasm in existential wiring. He posits that women are biologically wired for connection and social cohesion, while men are wired for competence, provision, and utility. To illustrate this, he contrasts two very famous modern business figures, Elon Musk and Arianna Huffington.
Okay, let's look at Elon Musk first.
During the critical Model 3 production crisis at Tesla, when the company was days away from bankruptcy, Musk famously slept on the factory floor. He didn't take a retreat. He didn't issue a press release about his mental health. He just engaged in raw, continuous, grueling production to save the structure he built.
And Arianna Huffington.
Riker contrasts this with Huffington, a highly successful female CEO who built a massive second career preaching corporate self-care, sleep hygiene, and mindfulness. But the detail Riker hones in on is that Huffington started calling burnout a silent epidemic only after she had already cashed out her millions and her companies had initiated massive layoffs.
So the message Riker pulls from this is stark. Women are socially permitted to exit the high-stress arenas and prioritize their well-being, but men are expected to endure until the job is done or they drop dead.
This is where Riker brilliantly applies the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, specifically Kant's categorical imperative.
Let's do a quick refresher on Kant. The categorical imperative basically means don't do an action unless you think it would be a good idea for literally everyone on Earth to do that exact same action all the time.
Right. It's a test of universal morality. That is a perfect summation. You act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, that it should become a universal law. Riker applies this directly to the psychology of the male provider. He says the male provider does not operate on feelings, he operates on a brutal internal maxim. If no one builds, all starve.
If no one builds, all starve. That is a heavy way to view the world.
So the man builds. He builds until his back gives out. This is what Riker calls the silent provider code. Men are the unseen gears of civilization. They are turning in the dark, under immense pressure, surrounded by dirt and grease, entirely without applause.
And the only time anyone notices the generator is when the power goes out, which ties directly into what the book calls the crisis compliance loop.
The crisis compliance loop is a fascinating sociological observation. Riker argues that male leadership, aggressive assertiveness, and a willingness to engage in physical violence and sacrifice are absolutely demanded by society during a disaster. If there is a war, a massive natural disaster, or a total economic collapse, society immediately turns to men and demands they exhibit these traits.
But the loop closes when times are good. During periods of peace, comfort, and high wealth, those exact same traits, assertiveness, aggression, tribal loyalty, are suddenly marginalized. They're pathologized and labeled as toxic by the very bureaucratic, female-led institutions that rely on men to protect them when the peace inevitably breaks.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we follow the logic here, society completely relies on this deeply ingrained, biologically driven male behavior to physically build and protect the world. But culturally, society is simultaneously suppressing, mocking, and pathologizing that exact same biology. That tension has to lead to a massive systemic breakdown. And that brings us to Section 3, Biological Mandates and the Erasure of Male Mentorship. Riker presents some data on testosterone that is, frankly, alarming.
He cites a highly significant peer-reviewed 2021 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA. The researchers tracked the average testosterone levels in adult men over several decades. They found that average levels have dropped by 1.4% every single year since 1980.
Meaning that over the last 4 decades, overall male testosterone levels have plummeted by a total of 25%. A quarter of male biological drive just erased.
And Raker doesn't look at this as just a weird health anomaly or a byproduct of microplastics. He views it as a literal civilizational crisis. And he links this biological suppression directly to state intervention in the institution of fatherhood.
He provides a chilling example of how this state intervention manifests, right?
Yeah.
The story from Canada.
Yes, in 2021, a Canadian father was subjected to a formal investigation by Child Protection Services, his alleged crime. He was in his own home, teaching his 12-year-old son how to completely disassemble, clean, and safely handle a hunting rifle.
He was investigated by the state for passing down a traditional practical skill regarding tool safety.
Yes. Riker traces the legal and philosophical framework for this kind of extreme state overreach all the way back to the 1979 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Wait, how does a UN convention from 1979 lead to a Canadian guy getting investigated for cleaning a rifle 40 years later?
Riker argues that the UN Convention was a Trojan horse. On the surface, it sounded incredibly noble, protecting the autonomy and safety of children globally. But he claims that if you look at the fine print and how the treaty was implemented in Western democracies, it effectively transferred ultimate authority away from the biological father and handed it directly to the state. Specifically, it handed power to what he describes as feminist-leaning, risk-averse social bureaucracies.
So almost overnight, legally speaking, the father was no longer recognized as the sovereign head of the household.
Exactly. He was suddenly viewed with baseline suspicion. His traditional methods of discipline, skill transfer, and risk exposure were suddenly viewed by the state as potential threats to the child's safety.
But Riker counters this administrative suspicion with hard sociological data showing that removing the father has devastating real-world consequences. He cites a 2021 study from the Social Science Quarterly. The data is incredibly clear. Boys who are raised primarily by their fathers or with a highly active father in the home are 40% less likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. Furthermore, they are 35% more likely to actually graduate from high school.
Riker uses these statistics to violently attack what he calls the feminized safety paradigm. This is the prevailing cultural narrative that insists mothers are the absolute essential core of a child's life, but fathers are somehow optional, interchangeable, or in the worst case framing, inherently dangerous.
So what does this safety paradigm actually produce, according to the book?
He argues that it doesn't actually keep boys safe. Instead, it sterilizes them of courage, resilience, and anti-fragility. By removing the father's rough-and-tumble play, his strict boundaries, and his push for independence, the state turns a boy's natural, boisterous strength into a medical pathology. It recasts male discipline as abuse.
And he makes the case that boys don't just need a father. They absolutely need male-only spaces and mentorship outside the home to truly thrive. He points back to the ancient Roman concept of feeds.
Feeds is a profound concept. In ancient Rome, it was the unwritten rule of trust and brotherhood among men. It wasn't a legal contract enforced by a magistrate. It was a deeply ingrained bond of honor between men that valued absolute loyalty to the group above mere individual survival.
Contrast that with modern corporate culture. Raker points out that today we have DEI departments and anonymous algorithm-driven job applications. We have essentially outsourced human trust to HR bots and compliance algorithms.
But the biological need for feeds hasn't gone away. To prove that men still desperately need this, Riker points to a 2021 Pew research poll. The researchers found that men who actively participate in male-only groups, and this could be anything from a hunting club to a veterans association to just a dedicated weekly poker game in a garage, report a massive 40% higher rate of overall life satisfaction compared to isolated men.
40% higher life satisfaction just from having a tribe. And it apparently translates to professional dominance as well. Riker cites a 2019 study from the Harvard Business Review. It confirmed that 78% of all Fortune 500 founders had at least one strong, older male mentor before they reached the age of 30.
And we aren't talking about a modern life coach or a therapist who validates their feelings. We are talking about a traditional male mentor who demanded excellence, challenged them to prove their capability, and didn't let them make excuses.
This leads to a really philosophical passage in the book. Riker equates the metaphysical transformation of a man becoming a father with the ancient transformations of a man becoming an ordained priest or a sworn soldier.
It is a profound comparison. He says that all three roles, father, priest, soldier, require a voluntary, complete surrender of personal autonomy for the sake of a higher duty. When a man takes on these roles, he is declaring that he is no longer living just to be personally fulfilled or happy. He is living to be responsible. His time, his body, and his life are no longer solely his own.
And he argues that the modern world is completely antithetical to this. The modern world worships self-actualization, constant travel, and infinite choices. But traditional masculinity demands sacrifice. When a culture actively tries to kill the concept of strict fatherhood, it is simultaneously killing the very concept of the devoted priest and the honorable soldier, because all three are rooted in the exact same biological and spiritual mandate of male responsibility.
Which brings us to arguably the most combative and controversial part of Riker's entire book.
Section 4, Deconstructing the Matriarchal Myth. We're looking at how history is written. Riker offers a very sharp, unrelenting critique of feminist anthropology, as well as modern educational and legal policies that he claims are actively rewriting history to penalize men.
He anchors this section with a story from Sweden in 2016. A Swedish school teacher was officially fired from his position. His offense was simply refusing to use newly mandated gender-neutral pronouns in his classroom. But it was his defense that Riker highlights. The teacher stated simply that men are stronger than women and that this basic, undeniable biological reality is the actual foundation of human civilization, not a system of arbitrary oppression.
Riker argues the firing wasn't really about making students feel comfortable with pronouns. It was about the state silencing biological truth because it contradicted the state ideology. And the data coming out of Sweden in the years since seems to validate his concern about these policies.
He points to a very revealing 2022 study from Uppsala University. The researchers looked at the long-term educational effects of Sweden's aggressive gender-neutral parenting and schooling policies. The result: over the study period, boys' reading comprehension dropped by a staggering 22%.
22%. That is a catastrophic failure of an educational system. And how did the girls fare?
The girls' scores stayed completely flat. The policy didn't elevate girls, it exclusively damaged boys. Furthermore, Riker points to Sweden's radical gender-neutral preschools. These specific schools literally ban the words boy and girl, forcing teachers to use words like friend and kiddo. They actively forbid toys like trucks or dolls that might reinforce binary thinking.
And the psychological outcome of this experiment.
A Stockholm University study found that boys placed in these specific hyper-engineered environments are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria later in childhood. Riker views this not as a triumph of gender liberation, but as a form of state-sponsored psychological grooming. He argues that normal, biologically driven boy behavior, rough and tumble play, loud voices, competition is being pathologized as defective girl behavior.
It's what he calls iatrogenic madness, an illness that is actually caused by the medical treatment itself.
But Riker doesn't just attack modern education, he turns his sights on the academic history departments, specifically the historical search for matriarchies. This is a fascinating deconstruction. Riker argues that for the last 50 years, feminist anthropologists have desperately scoured the historical and archaeological record, seeking out true matriarchies. They need these examples to validate their modern political ideology, to prove that male dominance is just a cultural construct, not a biological default. But Riker claims that every single example they hold up completely falls apart under rigorous objective scrutiny.
Let's walk through the specific examples he tackles, because I know a lot of these are taught as fact in universities right now.
Yeah.
First up, the Iroquois Confederacy in North America, which is constantly held up as this beautiful matrilineal utopia.
Riker points out a massive sleight of hand in how the Iroquois are taught. It is true that the society was matrilineal, meaning lineage was traced through the mother, and it is true that senior women had the power to select or depose clan leaders. However, Riker points out that women did not actually govern or project power. The sachems who ruled, the warriors who fought the brutal tribal wars, and the diplomats who negotiated complex treaties were exclusively men. The men still bore the ultimate burden of leadership and physical violence.
Okay, what about the Minoans of ancient Crete? They existed around 2000 to 1400 BCE. If you take an art history class, they are heavily romanticized for having all this beautiful art featuring priestesses and goddesses, supposedly proving a peaceful, female-led society.
Riker attacks this by pointing out what the archaeological art doesn't show. In all the ruins of the Minoan civilization, there is virtually no record of a standing army. There is no codified legal code that has been found. There are no massive fortifications and very few weapons. They were a society governed by ascetics and priests.
And what happened to them?
They were completely wiped out. Riker states bluntly, defenselessness is not a virtue, it is a death sentence. A society that cannot project physical force to protect its borders will inevitably be conquered by one that can. The Minoans aren't proof of a successful matriarchy, they are proof that ignoring the martial realities of the world gets your civilization erased.
Finally, he critiques a modern example that gets a lot of press. The Mozo people in the Yunnan province of China. They are famous for their walking marriages, where men just visit a woman's room at night and leave before dawn. They don't live together.
Western media constantly praises the Masuo as sexually liberated and free from patriarchal constraints. But Riker digs past the travel blog romanticism and looks at the brutal social outcomes. Because of the walking marriages, biological paternity is largely unacknowledged. Men have absolutely no legal, structural, or cultural role in the rearing of their own biological children.
And what is the result of that fatherlessness?
Riker points to incredibly high rates of child abandonment, massive emotional instability within the community, and a stagnant culture that relies entirely on government subsidies and gawking tourists to survive, rather than generating its own innovation or infrastructure. He views the Mosuo not as a matriarchy, but as a tragic social vacancy caused by the systemic erasure of fatherhood.
And then Riker saves his absolute harshest criticism for specific academic, Maria Gimbutas.
Gimbutas was a highly influential feminist anthropologist in the 1970s. She popularized the widespread idea that before the Indo-European migrations, there was a peaceful, egalitarian, earth-worshipping goddess culture spanning across old Europe. According to her theory, this peaceful utopia was violently destroyed by invading, horse-riding, patriarchal warlords.
It's basically the plot of every modern fantasy novel.
Exactly, but Riker dismisses Gimbutas' theories entirely as absolute pseudoscience wrapped in New Age spiritualism. He notes that her central claims have been thoroughly rejected by mainstream modern archaeology. There is zero hard evidence to support her claims. No excavated temples dedicated to female supreme rulers, no matriarchal legal codes found in the dirt.
Yet the myth is still taught. Why?
Riker argues it persists purely because it serves a modern political narrative. The idea that female rule inherently equals peace and male rule inherently equals violence. Riker counters this simplistic narrative by pointing out that some of the most violently destructive family dismantling regimes in modern history, like the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, were led by men who were actively trying to destroy traditional patriarchal family structures in the name of a progressive utopian year zero.
So if the historical basis for matriarchy is scientifically flawed, how is this ideology actually affecting our modern real-world institutions today? Riker points to the legal and academic worlds, where reality is being bent to fit the narrative. He cites a major scandal from Yale Law School in 2020.
The admissions data from Yale Law revealed that women were being systematically admitted under diversity and equity exemptions with LSAT scores that averaged 8 points lower than their male counterparts. In the elite tiers of law school admissions, an 8-point gap is the size of the Grand Canyon.
Riker views this as the literal death of meritocracy. He calls equity a Trojan horse designed to dismantle competence.
He highlights a highly specific, enraging case study from that data. A male candidate scoring in the 98th percentile on the LSAT who had already authored 2 published law reviews as an undergrad was rejected. Meanwhile, a female applicant scoring only in the 90th percentile with 0 academic publications was admitted. Her deciding qualification: a personal essay about feeling silenced by the patriarchy.
The system selected grievance over demonstrable excellence, and he points out that the academic system that produces these policies is a massive echo chamber. Riker cites that 94% of all gender studies publications in the United States are written exclusively by women, and 82% of the department chairs in those fields are women.
He argues this field is essentially an academic cartel. It produces 0 testable hypotheses, relies on circular citations, and acts as a closed feedback loop of ideological grievance. It is an environment fundamentally hostile to objective truth.
Which leads to a really chilling example from MIT.
Yes, a male scholar at MIT was subjected to a formal investigation for creating a hostile environment. What did he do? Did he harass someone? No. He simply tried to statistically analyze why women are underrepresented in high-level coding. His ultimate offense was citing publicly available massive data sets from Stack Overflow.
And what did the Stack Overflow data show that was so offensive?
The data showed that men are 7 times more likely to code purely for fun, in their free time, on weekends, without being paid for it. The male scholar suggested that this biological predisposition toward obsessive, systemizing behavior might explain the gender gap better than claims of systemic sexism, but logic and data once again were punished for contradicting the emotional narrative.
This rewriting of reality doesn't stop at data. It extends to how we tell the history of science itself. Riker introduces a concept that I think is going to stick with me for a long time: ideological taxidermy.
Ideological taxidermy is a brilliant phrase. Riker defines it as the act of taking a dead historical truth, hollowing it out, and stuffing it into a modern feminist museum display to serve a current political agenda.
And the prime example he uses to illustrate this is the modern narrative surrounding the chemist Rosalind Franklin and the discovery of the DNA double helix structure.
If you ask any college student today about the discovery of DNA, they will recite the popular modern narrative. James Watson and Francis Crick maliciously stole Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography data. She's painted as a wronged, brilliant female genius who was silenced and robbed by sexist men.
But Riker completely corrects this historical record using the actual documents from 1953.
He points out that Watson and Crick did not break into her lab and steal anything. They accessed her data through standard, universally accepted scientific channels at the time, specifically through her colleague Maurice Wilkins. Furthermore, Franklin herself never once claimed theft or foul play during her lifetime. She remained friendly with Crick. Riker argues she was an undeniably brilliant, highly competent chemist who contributed vital data. But today, she is being weaponized. She is being used as a martyr in a modern culture war she never actually fought, purely to erase and diminish the monumental Nobel Prize-winning achievement of the men who actually possessed the theoretical genius to build the final DNA model.
It's a complete hostile takeover of the cultural imagination. We're being told a story about the past that simply isn't true, to justify policies in the present. So where do men go when they are being erased from history and punished in the workplace? That flows right into Section 5, the media machine and the digital escapism epidemic. Riker analyzes how the modern manosphere is reacting to a culture that is actively, aggressively hostile to male presence. And the first place he looks is how men are reacting to the media.
He points to a very famous cultural flashpoint, the 2019 Gillette razor advertisement that explicitly focused on toxic masculinity. The ad essentially lectured its own customer base, portraying men in a montage as bullies, sexual harassers, and enablers of bad behavior.
I remember that ad. The media class loved it.
They did. It won major advertising prizes at Cannes. The cultural elite praised it as brave, but Riker notes the actual financial reality. Gillette's sales fell by an astonishing 40% in the aftermath. Men watched the ad, refused to accept the insult, and quietly responded with their wallets. They just bought different razors.
But the media apparatus didn't learn the lesson. They pushed harder. Riker looks at Hollywood, specifically movies like Marvel's Captain Marvel. He points out a recurring modern trope where traditional male leadership figures are systematically portrayed as either physically weak, morally deceitful, or outright evil. Meanwhile, the female instinct is presented as inherently flawless and superior from the opening scene.
He cites a really telling statistic about the stories we are telling children. He notes that in animated movies, the use of the female savior trope jumped from just 12% in the year 2000 to a massive 63% today.
And why does that matter structurally?
Because it fundamentally changes the mythology of growth. The traditional hero's journey, the framework used from ancient myths to Star Wars, involves a flawed protagonist who must face challenge, endure severe sacrifice, learn humility, and grow into competence. Riker argues that is being replaced by a modern narrative where the female protagonist is already utterly perfect from day one, and the only struggle she faces is waiting for the incompetent men around her to step aside and realize her brilliance. It teaches boys that they are inherently flawed and teaches girls that they require no improvement.
And how are men, particularly young men, reacting to this relentless cultural erasure? Riker says they aren't fighting back, they are fleeing. He introduces us to the core of the modern crisis, the escapism epidemic.
To ground this in reality, he profiles a composite figure he calls Greg from Seattle.
We all know a Greg. Maybe we've even been a Greg for a weekend.
Exactly. Greg is 28 years old. He is highly intelligent, making $180,000 a year coding AI systems for a major tech firm. But Greg hasn't left his apartment for anything other than essential groceries in 6 months. He has 0 real-world friends. He doesn't date. But he has logged 2,400 hours in the brutal, highly difficult video game Elden Ring, and on his dedicated Discord server, he is revered as a literal king.
You know, when we hear a story like that, the instinct is to mock Greg, to say he's a loser or he needs to touch grass. But when the book frames this not as a failure of the individual, but as a completely rational retreat from a society that hates him, that really flips the script on how we view gaming addiction.
Riker insists Greg isn't an anomaly. He points out that currently 42% of American men between the ages of 25 and 34 are living with their parents. And this isn't just an American problem, it is a global phenomenon in post-industrial societies.
He brings up South Korea.
Yes, South Korea is the canary in the coal mine. They have a term for this, the Sampo generation. The data shows that 73% of South Korean men under the age of 35 have simply given up. They have permanently abandoned the pursuit of romantic love, marriage, and having children. They have looked at the economic demands, the cultural hostility, and the fact that family courts are stacked entirely against them, and they have made a cold, logical decision to completely disengage from the social contract.
Riker describes this new existence as digital feudalism, and the mechanics behind it are terrifying.
He explains that companies like Epic Games or massive pornography conglomerates like MindGeek are employing literal ex-MIT neuroscientists. Their entire job is engineering what the industry calls attention harvesting.
They aren't just making fun games, they are hacking the brainstem.
Exactly. They have successfully reverse-engineered fundamental male biological desires. They take the ancient hunter's focus, the need for tribal loyalty, and the builder's pride in constructing a hierarchy, and they weaponize it. They turn those deep evolutionary drives into a digital Skinner box that dispenses dopamine in exchange for time and money.
In this new feudalism, the Twitch streamers are the new feudal lords. They sit in gaming chairs, earning millions of dollars a year, while millions of young, isolated men pay them tribute in the form of monthly subscriptions, just to feel like they are part of a tribe.
Take a legacy game like World of Warcraft. Riker notes that the player base is 78% male, and the average player spends 22 hours per week in the game.
22 hours. That is a part-time job. They're working a second job in a fake world because the real world won't give them a promotion.
Riker uses a brilliant, dark analogy for this exact phenomenon. He calls it Oedipus with a GPU.
Explain that, because it's a hell of a phrase.
Oedipus, in Greek tragedy, unknowingly creates his own doom. Riker points out the tragic paradox of Silicon Valley. Men make up roughly 80% of the elite engineering talent in tech. Men built the hardware. Men coded the algorithms. Men designed the dopamine traps. Men built the very matrix that is now actively replacing their real-world communities and harvesting their sons.
They've built the digital prison that they are now voluntarily locking themselves inside. Riker even touches on the absolute extreme dark end of this isolation.
Yeah.
The incel community, the involuntary celibates. He notes that since 2014, the FBI has collected and analyzed over 14,000 incel manifestos.
But Riker takes a very controversial stance here. He doesn't dismiss them simply as deranged radicals or terrorists, which is the standard media framing. He provocatively refers to them as rationalists.
Rationalists. But how does he justify that?
Yeah, he argues that these young men have applied cold, unflinching logic to their own lives. They have looked at the hyper-competitive modern dating market, driven by dating apps that consolidate the top 10% of men, and they have concluded that the modern social system is fundamentally, mathematically unwinnable for a man of average status or looks. So like a chess player realizing they are mated in 3 moves, they flip the board.
It is a mass retreat into what Riker calls the basement economy.
Yes. These men aren't starving. They are earning money through cryptocurrency trading, freelance coding, and competitive gaming. They are financially autonomous and entirely self-sufficient. But they are utterly, hopelessly isolated. They choose the digital world because in a video game or a crypto market, they can still actually earn their rank through pure merit. In the real world, every time they display a desire for rank or hierarchy, they are told it is a form of toxic oppression. So they defect from a losing army to join a winning simulation.
But Riker doesn't end this massive book in a state of black-pilled despair. And that brings us to the final part of our deep dive. Section 6, The Red Pill Awakening and the Renaissance of Men. This is where Riker pivots from diagnosing the disease to outlining his proposed solution. A mass awakening and a physical migration of men to alternative spaces where they can reclaim objective truth.
He marks the beginning of this modern awakening with a very specific cultural moment. Jordan Peterson in 2015.
The pronoun controversy at the University of Toronto.
Exactly. When Peterson publicly calmly refused to use compelled gender-neutral pronouns mandated by Canadian law, it was a watershed moment. That simple refusal to bend his tongue to a state-mandated ideology made Peterson an absolute pariah in the mainstream media. But Riker argues it resonated deeply, almost spiritually, with millions of men who felt suffocated by an HR culture of compelled speech.
Riker also brings up James Damore, the former Google engineer.
Damore wrote an internal memo citing mainstream peer-reviewed psychological studies regarding biological differences in cognitive interests between men and women. He was summarily fired for it. But Riker highlights a crucial piece of data. Internal surveys at Google leaked after the firing showed that 90% of Google's own engineers secretly supported Damore's memo. The silent majority of men living in fear of HR was massive.
Yet the corporate censorship only accelerated from there. Riker points out the blatant hypocrisy of platforms like Amazon. They actively remove books by figures like Andrew Tate, books that largely focused on male discipline, physical fitness, and financial independence, while simultaneously allowing books with literal titles like Kill the Patriarchy to remain readily available for purchase.
This blatant hypocrisy fuels what Riker calls the red pill paradox.
Let's break down the paradox.
The paradox is this. When a society becomes so corrupted by ideology that it labels basic biological truth and fundamental logic as extremism, the rational man has no other choice but to become a revolutionary. Riker points out how the language itself has been stolen. The term toxic masculinity wasn't invented by radical feminists. It was originally coined by men's movement leaders like Robert Bly in the 1990s to help men identify genuinely harmful behaviors. But it was hijacked and weaponized by ideological institutions to pathologize normal male ambition and self-reliance.
Because of this hostility, Riker describes a massive ongoing digital migration. Men are realizing they cannot win in the mainstream digital gulag.
And he uses that term specifically to refer to platforms operating under legislation like the European Union's Digital Services Act of 2023, which heavily censors speech that goes against state narratives. So men are packing up and moving to alternative platforms. They are moving to Rumble for video, Signal for encrypted communication, and Odyssey for uncensorable content. They're essentially building their own parallel digital fortresses.
But Riker insists it's not just a digital migration. It has to be a real-world renaissance. And he points to some amazing data regarding the trades. He cites a study showing that 73% of men who skip college and finish blue-collar apprenticeships report incredibly high life satisfaction, significantly higher than their peers carrying massive debt from liberal arts degrees.
He highlights specific real-world examples of this renaissance, like the Iron Oak Academy in Ohio.
Tell me about Iron Oak, because this sounds like the exact antidote to the Toronto Chess Club's story.
Iron Oak Academy was founded by ex-military men. They utilize what they call a tribe-to-work pipeline. They take young, aimless men and put them through rigorous physical and technical training.
They have a ceremony called the Friday Hammer Ritual. Right? What does that actually look like?
It is incredibly powerful. At the end of a grueling week of work, a master journeyman publicly hands an apprentice a physical tool, a hammer, a wrench. It isn't just an empty corporate certificate of completion. It is a physical, weighty contract of earned respect between men. Riker notes that male-only work teams in construction industries actually have 30% fewer safety incidents than mixed teams.
Wait, really? Why is that?
Because men in male-only spaces communicate directly. They brutally and immediately correct each other's mistakes without the passive aggression, the fear of offending someone, or the HR drama found in feminized corporate spaces. The bluntness keeps them safe.
Riker actually maps out what he calls the red pill pipeline. He cites a 2023 study from the Heterodox Academy that claims 12% of young men are now actively following this documented life path.
The pipeline has 4 distinct stages. It starts with media distrust. They realize the news is lying to them. That leads to philosophical inquiry. They start reading history and philosophy. That leads to hard skill acquisition. They learn to weld, code, or shoot. And it culminates in entrepreneurial action. They start their own businesses so they can't be fired by an HR department.
To sustain this immense effort, Riker notes that 78% of the successful male entrepreneurs he surveyed follow what he calls the 5 a.m. protocol.
This is a strict regimen. It involves waking up at 5 a.m., reading substantive, difficult texts like Aristotle's Ethics or Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, specifically focusing on stoicism and duty. It involves lifting heavy weights to build physical mass and then planning the day with ruthless clarity. It is about total self-mastery, not therapeutic self-help.
He also advocates for something he calls the fatherhood audit. He ran an experiment where he asked 200 fathers to ruthlessly track their time, their financial input, and their disciplinary consistency with their children for just 7 days.
The results were immediate. After just 1 week of treating fatherhood like a tactical mission rather than a passive role, 82% of the men reported massive increased clarity in their overall life purpose. Riker argues that truth is inherently masculine. It doesn't negotiate with your feelings, it simply demands action.
If we pull all of this together, Riker makes it unequivocally, forcefully clear that the manosphere, despite what the legacy media claims, is not a hate group.
He frames it entirely as a resistance movement. These are men who have recognized a hostile system and are focusing all their energy on building autonomy, forging deep loyalty, and pursuing objective truth.
They are engaging in what he calls hero dieting.
Yes. Just like you would cut junk food out of your physical diet, these men are meticulously curating their media consumption. They only consume stories, podcasts, and books that respect male agency and treat traditional male sacrifice as noble rather than toxic. They are wholesale rejecting the cultural narrative that male nature is a disease that needs to be cured.
Which brings us to this summary of this absolute behemoth of a book. The sheer scale of Riker's worldview is staggering. He is looking at history, biology, economics, and culture, and he is issuing a dire, blaring warning to the Western world.
The core warning is this: a civilization absolutely cannot survive if it fundamentally pathologizes its own builders. You cannot build a bridge, maintain a power grid, or defend a border using empathy and consensus alone. The survival of society requires the rigid structure, the extreme risk tolerance, and the physical sacrifice that are biologically inherently coded into men. If you tell men they are toxic, they will simply stop building your world.
It is an incredibly heavy, thought-provoking text. And to close out this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought built directly on the source material we spent the last hour exploring. I want you to really visualize this. Think about the physical infrastructure of our world. The massive power grids humming with high voltage, the steel suspension bridges spanning rivers, the freezing shipping lanes in the Pacific, the very subterranean fiber optic cables that make the internet we are using right now possible. All of it was built, and all of it is currently maintained, by the masculine drive for competence, risk, and silent provision. So what happens when the digital monastery completely absorbs the next generation of builders? When the best, brightest, and strongest young men decide to permanently retreat into video games, cryptocurrency markets, and digital isolation, because the real world tells them their natural ambition is toxic, what happens then? Will the physical real world simply stop functioning when the very last unseen gear finally decides to stop turning?
It is a genuinely chilling question, and it is exactly the kind of existential structural threat that Conrad Riker believes we are facing right now, at this very moment in history.
It really makes you look at every building you walk into and every road you drive on completely differently, regardless of whether you agree with all of his political conclusions. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dense, fascinating journey today. We really appreciate you giving us your time. If this deep dive sparked your curiosity, if you want to read the raw data, see the footnotes, and explore the full uncut arguments for yourself, you absolutely need to go buy Conrad Riker's ebook, Beyond Infinite Anaximander's Boundless Universe. It is available right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And please don't forget to check out the author's continued thoughts by following @Conrad Riker on Substack.
We covered a massive amount of ground today, but believe it or not, we only scratched the surface. There's so much more depth waiting for you in the actual book.
Absolutely. Please remember to take a second to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss an exploration like this one. To the learner out there listening, keep questioning everything, keep reading the primary sources, and we will see you on the next deep dive.